The National Guard sergeant didn't look at me when he said it. He was looking at the clipboard, then past me, already counting heads in the line behind us, already doing math. No animals on the bus. I heard him fine. The words arrived clean and simple. But my brain treated them like a foreign language, something I'd need to sit with, turn over, parse for alternate meaning. Because the alternative, the literal meaning, wasn't something I could integrate while standing on a curb in southeast Portland with a 60-pound pit mix pressed against my shin and the last evacuation bus idling 20 feet away. She won't take up a seat. She can sit on the floor between my legs. She's calm. Sir. Now he looked at me. Brown eyes, mid-20s, a face that had been making this exact calculation all morning. There's no room. We've got 43 seats and 111 people in this line. Families, children. I can't give floor space to a dog. My name is Owen Dillard. I was 31 years old, a land surveyor for Multnomah County. Single, no kids, no family within 800 miles. I had an apartment in Selwood with a leaking kitchen faucet I'd been meaning to fix for 11 months. I had a truck with a quarter tank of gas that I'd parked 6 blocks east because the military checkpoint wouldn't let civilian vehicles past Chavez Boulevard. And I had Bo. Bo was 7. I'd gotten her at 4 from a rescue in Gresham. She'd been found in a house with 9 other dogs and no people, surviving on drywall dust and rainwater leaking through a broken window. When I brought her home, she didn't bark for 3 weeks, didn't make a sound, just watched me, tracking every movement with these deep amber eyes, waiting to see if I was the kind of person who stayed. I stayed. And now, a 20-something soldier with a clipboard was telling me to leave her on a curb in a city that was eating itself alive. There's a shelter, he said, softer now. He could see my face. FEMA's setting up a staging area at the convention center. They're taking animals. The convention center is 4 miles north. I passed it on the way here. It's on fire. He didn't have an answer for that. He glanced at the bus, then back at the line. A woman behind me shifted her toddler to her other hip, her eyes communicating what her mouth wouldn't. Move or move aside. I understood her. I did. If I'd had a child on my hip, I would have hated me too. Last call for boarding, the driver shouted from the door. We're not waiting. The sergeant looked at me one more time. There was something in it, not cruelty, not indifference. Fatigue, the arithmetic of triage. He'd been subtracting all morning, and I was just another number that didn't fit. I'm sorry, he said. I stepped out of the line. Just like that. No dramatic speech, no confrontation. I took one step to the right, and the line flowed forward like water around a stone, filling the space I'd occupied as though I'd never been there. A man in a Timbers jersey brushed past me without eye contact. A teenage girl with a cello case, an actual cello case, boarded ahead of me. And I watched the case take up the space where Bo could have curled on the floor between my feet. The bus doors closed. The air brakes released with a hiss that sounded like the city exhaling. I watched it pull away from the curb, turn south onto Milwaukee Avenue, and shrink until the diesel shimmer swallowed it. Bo pressed harder against my leg. Not whining, not anxious, just making sure I knew she was still there. Yeah, I said, I know. That was September 14th. The buses didn't come back. I need to be honest about something before this goes any further. When I stepped out of that line, I wasn't brave. I wasn't making a stand. I was numb. The decision happened below language, in the part of the brain that operates on reflex and attachment, and the inability to picture yourself doing the unthinkable thing. Leaving Bo on that curb would have required me to untie the leash from my wrist, set it on the ground, and walk away while she watched. I couldn't build that sequence in my head. So I didn't. Bravery is what people do when they see both options clearly and choose the harder one. I just couldn't see the other option at all. What I could see, standing on that empty curb with the bus exhaust still hanging in the air, was that Portland was coming apart at the seams, not in the cinematic way, not explosions and screaming hordes. It was quieter than that, and worse. Smoke from 3 separate fires smudged the sky into a yellow-brown haze that turned the September sun the color of a bruised peach. The power had been out for 2 days. The streets were wrong, half empty in places that should have been packed, gridlocked in places that should have been clear. A Trimette bus sat sideways across Holgate, every window punched out, dark stains on the steps that I didn't examine. Dogs, other people's dogs, trotted in loose, confused packs along the sidewalks, still wearing collars, still looking for doors that would open. Bo watched them. Her ears tracked their movement, but she didn't pull. I had my pack. I'd grabbed it when the first evacuation order came through a Kelty Coyote 80 I used for backcountry survey work. Inside, 2 liters of water, 4 granola bars, a headlamp, a first aid kit, a Leatherman, a rain shell, a wool base layer. Survival basics for a weekend in the Cascades, not for the end of the world. I had Bo's leash, a collapsible water bowl, and half a gallon Ziploc of her kibble. What I did not have: a weapon, a plan, a vehicle with gas, a destination, a single person expecting me anywhere. I started walking east. Not because east was safe, I had no information about what was safe, but because east meant away from downtown, away from density, toward the hills and eventually the gorge and eventually open land. The calculus was primitive. People were dangerous. Infected people were more dangerous. Fewer people meant fewer of both. We made it 4 blocks before I saw my first one up close. She was in the parking lot of a grocery outlet, sitting against the tire of a shopping cart corral. From a distance, she looked drunk or asleep, slumped posture, chin on chest. But the color was wrong. That gray-violet model I'd seen on the news footage before the broadcasts stopped, like bruising that didn't know where to settle. And the sound. I was still 30 yards away and I could hear it. A wet, adhesive clicking from her throat, like someone chewing with their mouth open in an echoey room. Bo stopped walking. Not a freeze, she just stopped, lowered her head about 2 inches and her weight shifted backward onto her haunches. No growl, no bark, just a quiet, total refusal to move closer. I trusted her. We crossed the street. The woman didn't follow. She didn't even look up. Whatever stage she was in, she wasn't hunting yet. But the clicking followed us for another half block, carried on the still air. And I realized that I'd been hearing that sound faintly for the last 20 minutes. From doorways, from parked cars, from the dark mouth of a laundromat, with its door propped open by a sneaker. The city wasn't empty. It was full of people in the middle of becoming something else, and I was walking through them with a dog and 4 granola bars. The smartest thing I did on day 1 wasn't courage or planning. It was remembering where I'd parked. My truck, a 2014 Tacoma with 200,000 miles of survey roads on the odometer, was 6 blocks east of the checkpoint. Nosed into a residential side street off Holgate where I'd left it that morning when the military cordon stopped civilian traffic. 1/4 tank of gas, maybe 4 gallons. In a truck that got 19 miles to the gallon on a generous day, that was 75 miles if I babied it. 75 miles of distance between me and a city that was filling up with that clicking sound. The streets were passable if you were willing to drive on sidewalks. I was. Bo sat in the passenger seat with her head below the window line, not because I told her to, but because she'd already decided the world outside the glass was something she didn't want to watch. Smart dog, smarter than me. I was watching everything, cataloging it, burning images into memory that would cost me sleep for months. A man on a roof waving a bedsheet at a sky where no helicopters flew. A school bus on its side with the emergency exit hanging open like a dislocated jaw. Two people fighting over a case of water in a Fred Meyer parking lot with a ferocity that told me the infection wasn't the only thing turning people into animals. I drove east on Powell, then south on 82nd to avoid the worst of the gridlock. Then picked up Foster Road, heading southeast toward the edge of the city. Every intersection was a negotiation. Abandoned cars created choke points that required three-point turns, curb hopping, one stretch where I drove through someone's front yard and took out a mailbox shaped like a fish. I didn't stop. Stopping was dying. That was the one rule I'd already learned. At the Clackamas River crossing, I had my first real decision. The bridge was blocked. Not by cars, by people. 30, maybe 40, clustered at the near end with bags and strollers and the same desperate, calculating faces I'd seen in the evacuation line. They'd seen the truck. They were already moving toward it. A man in the front was holding up both hands, palms out, the universal gesture for please and stop simultaneously. I slowed. Bo sat up, reading my hesitation. This is where I tell you I drove through them without stopping, and you judge me for it. Or I tell you I stopped, and you wait for the story of how it went wrong. Both of those are the versions you're expecting. The truth is messier. I stopped. I rolled down the window 2 inches. The man reached me first. "The bridge is out on the other side," he said. "Jackknife tanker. You can't get through." "Is there another crossing?" "The 224 bridge, maybe. 2 miles south." "But there are..." He glanced behind him, lowered his voice. "They're in the water, under the bridge. We saw them. They went in upstream, and they didn't come out the other side." I looked at the river. It was moving fast, September rain having swelled it beyond its usual lazy crawl. The surface showed nothing. That meant nothing. "Can I take anyone?" I asked. I don't know why I asked. The truck had one bench seat and a dog who'd claimed the passenger side. "Take the Walshes," a woman called from behind him. "They've got a baby." I took the Walshes. Peter and Dana and a 7-week-old named Caleb, who slept through the entire crossing in a car seat wedged behind the center console. Bo sniffed the baby once, then pointedly looked out the window as though she'd been asked to share her space and had decided to be civil about it. I dropped them at a church on the far side of the 224 bridge where a cluster of people were establishing something that looked like organization. Dana Walsh grabbed my forearm through the window and held on with a grip that left marks. "What's your name?" "Owen." "Owen what?" "Dillard. We'll remember." She let go. I drove south. The gas needle touched the quarter line and kept sinking. Somewhere behind me, the Walshes were trusting a stranger's church. And ahead of me was nothing but timber company land and fire roads I half remembered from survey work 3 years ago. 75 miles was generous. I had maybe 50. I needed a place where 50 miles would be enough. The place found me before I found it. That's the honest version. I was on a Forest Service road southeast of Estacada, running on fumes and intuition, when the Tacoma's engine coughed twice and died on a grade. I'd been watching the gauge drop for the last 9 miles with a calm fatalism of someone who has already accepted the next disaster and is just waiting for it to announce itself. The truck rolled backward until I set the parking brake. Silence flooded in, not city silence, which is just quieter noise, but actual silence. Trees and wind and the distant argument of a creek. Bo looked at me. "I know," I said. "We're walking." What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that I'd run out of gas 400 yards below a decommissioned USGS stream gauging station that I'd surveyed once in 2021 for a county watershed assessment. The memory surfaced slowly, like something rising through murky water. A concrete pad, a metal-roofed shelter built over monitoring equipment, a hand pump well that the Forest Service had drilled in the 80s for fire suppression staging. I shouldered my pack and walked uphill, Bo ranging ahead with her nose working the ground. And when the tree line broke, I saw it. A squat, ugly building the color of moss, maybe 600 square feet, with a corrugated roof and a padlocked steel door. And the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, a gravity-fed water spigot with a slow, steady drip that said the well was still pressurized. I sat down on the concrete pad and cried, not gracefully, not cinematically. Messy, stupid crying. The kind where your nose runs and you can't breathe and you're making sounds that would embarrass you if anyone were listening. Bo circled back, sat down beside me, and leaned her weight against my ribs. She didn't lick my face or whine or perform comfort. She just leaned, 60 pounds of warm pressure against my side that said, "I'm here, we're here, this is where we are." The padlock gave way to 10 minutes of Leatherman work. Inside, a workbench, a defunct telemetry unit, a wall-mounted first aid kit, a mouse-eaten Forest Service manual, a propane camp stove with one canister, and a cot with a foam mattress that smelled like mildew and salvation. I locked the door behind us and didn't open it until morning. I'm going to describe what I had, because what you have is what you are when the world stops resupplying you. The station had a well that worked. That alone was worth more than anything I'd carried in. Clean water, hand-pumped, unlimited as long as the aquifer held. In Western Oregon, in a watershed fed by Cascade snowpack, that was as close to a guarantee as the New World offered. Food, 4 granola bars, Bo's half-gallon of kibble, a can of Folgers coffee left by some Forest Service technician who never came back for it, and a jar of peanut butter in a cabinet that was past its date but sealed. 900 calories a day, if I stretched it. Maybe 5 days for me, 4 for Bo. After that, nothing. Shelter, sound. The station was built for equipment, not comfort, but concrete block walls and a metal roof meant wind, rain, and casual intrusion were handled. 1 door, 2 windows, both small enough that nothing larger than a raccoon was coming through without noise. Defensible by accident. Lucky. Tools, my Leatherman, a rusty bow saw hanging on a wall peg, a flathead screwdriver, a roll of baling wire. And this mattered more than I understood at the time, a spool of paracord left in a drawer, alongside a box of waterproof matches. Someone had staged this place for fire season and never cleaned it out. What I did not have: a firearm, a radio, a way to communicate with anyone, a vehicle that ran, enough food to last a week. I sat on the cot that first night and did math by headlamp while Bo slept on the floor. The numbers were clear. I had water and shelter. I had no food supply beyond 4 days. I was 12 miles from the nearest town, which was a town I'd watched go dark from the ridge above. I was alone in the woods, with a dog who depended on me and a body that would start degrading within 72 hours of caloric deficit. The math said, You're going to starve here, just slower than you'd starve in the city. But the math didn't account for the creek. I'd heard it from the road. 200 yards north of the station, screened by Douglas fir and alder, a tributary of the Clackamas River, cut through a rocky channel on its way downhill. In the morning, I walked down to look at it and saw what a surveyor sees: gradient, flow rate, substrate. What a hungry man sees is different. I saw crawdads in the shallows. I saw a pool below a logjam where the current slowed and deepened. I saw fish. Small ones, juvenile steelhead, maybe cutthroat, but alive, present, catchable in theory if you had line and a hook. I didn't have a hook. I had baling wire. The first trap took me 2 hours to build, and it didn't work. The second one, modified with a finer mesh of wire and baited with peanut butter smeared on a rock, caught 3 crawdads overnight. I boiled them in the Folgers can over the camp stove and split the meat with Bo. It was barely a mouthful each. It was also proof of concept, and proof of concept is what keeps you from lying down. By the end of the first week, I had a trap line of 6 wire cages running the length of the creek. I was pulling 8 to 12 crawdads a day, supplemented by a fishing technique so crude it would make any angler weep a wire hook on paracord. Hand cast into the deep pool, baited with crawdad guts. I caught my first trout on day 5. It was 9 inches long, and I cooked it on a flat rock beside the stove and ate it with my fingers, and it was the best meal of my life. Bo ate what I ate. I never once considered a division that didn't include her. This was not generosity. This was the deal. The deal was we stayed together. And staying together meant sharing everything, including hunger. She lost weight faster than I did those first weeks. Her ribs started showing through her brindle coat, and I'd lie awake on the cot with my hand on her flank, counting them, promising her things I had no power to deliver. She never begged. She'd sit by the stove when I cooked and wait. When I put her portion down, she ate it without rushing. When there was nothing, she'd drink water and lie down. No reproach, no accusation, just an animal's absolute trust that the person she'd chosen would figure it out. I had to figure it out. By week 3, I'd established something that resembled a routine. And routine was the thin crust over an abyss of fear that I could not afford to look into. Wake at dawn, pump water, check trap line, reset traps, gather. I'd started foraging by then, clumsily, using the mildewed Forest Service manual that had a chapter on regional edible plants. Miner's lettuce, wood sorrel, thimbleberries when I found them, which wasn't often enough. I'd eat my morning ration on the concrete pad and watch the tree line while Bo did her own patrol of the perimeter. Her perimeter. That's the thing. I built a perimeter-cleared brush in a 50-foot radius around the station, strung paracord between trees at shin height with cans attached that would rattle if disturbed. Boy Scout stuff, rudimentary. A psychological barrier more than a physical one. But Bo built her own perimeter that was better than mine. She'd circle the station every morning and evening in an expanding spiral, nose down, reading a newspaper I couldn't see. When something was wrong, a scent that didn't belong, a sound below my hearing threshold, she'd stop at the exact bearing of the disturbance and go still. Not rigid. Not aggressive. Still. Every muscle quiet, every sense aimed at a single point, waiting. I learned to trust her stillness more than my eyes. Day 18 was the first test. I was at the creek checking traps when Bo, up at the station, went still. I couldn't hear her, that was the signal. No bark, no whine. Just the absence of her usual ambient noise. The panting, the shifting, the scratch of nails on concrete. I looked up the slope and saw her standing on the pad, facing northwest, locked. I left the traps, moved uphill slowly, reached her, and followed her sightline into the trees. There were 2 of them on the fire road, 60 yards out. They'd been people once. Now they were that color, that wrong gray-violet that meant the blood was doing something blood shouldn't do. And they moved with a stuttering, recalibrating gait that I'd seen in every clip before the internet died. One was wearing a high-visibility vest, maybe a road worker or a utility crew member. The other was barefoot, in hospital scrub bottoms and nothing else. And the sound, that clicking, that wet adhesive clicking, carried through the trees like a language I was being forced to learn. They weren't tracking us. They were following the road, pulled by whatever gradient of stimulus their rewired brains chased. Wind direction was in my favor. Bo hadn't barked. We were ghosts to them. And they were passing. They were passing. They were almost past. A can rattled. My perimeter. One of them had walked through my paracord tripwire on the edge of the fire road, and a Folgers can with 3 pebbles inside bounced off a root and made a sound that, in the silence of the watershed, might as well have been a gunshot. Both heads turned, not toward the can, toward us. The clicking stopped, replaced by something worse, a pressurized, rasping intake of air, like a dog scenting but mechanical, broken, overclocked. Bo growled, low and deep from the bottom of her chest, a sound I'd heard exactly once before when a coyote had come into the yard of my Selwood apartment, and she'd stood at the sliding glass door and announced that nothing was coming through. I put my hand on her collar. She stopped growling. The silence after was louder. They stood there. We stood here. 60 yards and a few trees and whatever calculus was running behind those flat, rewritten eyes. Then the one in the vest turned and walked south. The barefoot one followed. The clicking resumed, fading. I didn't move for 10 minutes. Bo didn't either. We stood on that concrete pad and breathed and waited. And when I was sure, when Bo's body unlocked, and she shook herself the way dogs do when the tension passes, I went inside, and I closed the door, and I sat on the floor with my back against the wall. And I held her. And I understood, fully for the first time, what I had chosen. Not a dog over a bus seat, not sentiment over survival. I had chosen the only living thing that would stand next to me in the dark and growl at what was coming. October took the easy food. The crawdads slowed as water temperature dropped. The fish moved deeper or downstream, beyond the reach of my crude wire hook. Thimbleberries were gone. The miner's lettuce thinned. I was eating things by mid-October that I couldn't identify with certainty. Cross-referencing a water-stained field guide against plants I held in my shaking hands. Making judgment calls that could end in nourishment or organ failure with no one to consult and no margin for error. I got it wrong once. A root I'd mistaken for wild carrot, there was something else I never confirmed what. 6 hours of cramping and vomiting behind the station while Bo sat next to me with her ears flat, watching me retch into the dirt with an expression that I interpreted, perhaps generously, as concern. I lost 2 days of productivity to that mistake. 2 days I couldn't trap, couldn't forage, couldn't gather firewood. 2 days lying on the cot sweating through my base layer while the calorie deficit widened into a hole I could feel in my bones. The body changes. I knew this abstractly. Prolonged caloric deficit triggers a cascade of adaptations that are sophisticated and ancient and deeply unpleasant. What I didn't know what no abstract knowledge prepares you for is the mental dimension. Hunger doesn't just hurt, it simplifies. By November, my thoughts had a narrow, grooved quality, like a record skipping. Food, water, warmth, Bo. The complex inner life I'd once maintained, opinions about movies, political frustrations, memories of college, the face of the woman I'd dated for 2 years in my 20s, all of it compressed into a thin hum beneath the 4-word mantra that ran my days. I started talking to Bo. Not the casual narration that dog owners do, who's a good girl, want to go outside, but actual conversation. Sustained, detailed, one-sided dialogue about what I was doing and why, what I planned for tomorrow, what I remembered about the world before. I told her about my parents in Tucson and how I hadn't called them the week before everything fell apart because I'd been busy with a survey deadline that now meant nothing. I told her about a girl named Margot who'd broken up with me by leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I can't keep waiting for you to want something," and how I'd kept the note in my wallet for a year without understanding why. I told her about the Walshes, about the baby named Caleb, about whether the church had held or fallen. Bo listened. She always listened. Her head would track my voice, ears adjusting to my tone, and occasionally she'd huff or shift position in a way that felt like punctuation. It was enough. It was too much. It was the only thing keeping the architecture of language intact inside my skull, and I didn't understand how important that was until later, when I almost lost it. November brought rain that didn't stop, Western Oregon rain, not dramatic but relentless. A gray curtain that turned the world into a watercolor smear and drove the cold into everything. The station's roof held, but the door leaked at the threshold, and I spent hours I didn't have stuffing the gap with moss and strips of my rain shell, sacrificing waterproof gear for indoor dryness, making trades that only make sense when you're living minute to minute. I'd built a wood stove. That's a generous description. I'd knocked a hole through the back wall of the station with a flathead screwdriver and a rock, widened it to 6 inches, fitted a length of metal duct I'd salvaged from the telemetry housing, and created a vent for a fire pit made of stacked concrete chunks on the station floor. It smoked badly. It heated unevenly. It was the difference between hypothermia and survival. So I loved it the way you love anything that keeps you alive, fiercely, irrationally, with full knowledge of its flaws. Bo slept closer to me as the temperature dropped. By late November, she was on the cot, pressed against my stomach, her body heat radiating through the sleeping bag I'd fashioned from the foam mattress and my wool layer. I could feel her heartbeat against my ribs. Slower than mine, steadier, a metronome of animal calm that regulated my breathing without my permission. I weighed myself using a plank balanced on the workbench as a crude scale, calibrated against the Folgers can filled with a known volume of water. The number was approximate, and the approximation was terrifying. I'd lost maybe 30 pounds in 2 months. Bo had lost proportionally more. When she stood in profile, I could count every rib, and the knobs of her spine stood up like a mountain ridge under her coat. We were starving, slowly, measurably, together. The deer changed everything, and it almost killed me. Early December, I was checking the trap line 3 crawdads that morning, which was good for December, almost a feast when Bo locked again. Different bearing this time, not the fire road. Uphill, northeast, deeper into the timber. I watched her and waited. A black-tailed doe stepped out of the fur stand at 40 yards. Young, maybe a yearling, alone, which was unusual. She was browsing on the edge of a clearing where I'd noticed Salal and Oregon grape, completely unaware of us. Downwind, screened by brush. A gift. I had no gun, no bow, no weapon designed for killing anything larger than a crawdad. What I had was the bow saw, the Leatherman, 50 feet of paracord, and a desperation that had been sharpening itself against my ribs for 11 weeks. I'm not going to describe the kill in detail. I'll tell you it took 3 days. I built a snare on a game trail I'd identified by following her tracks, using paracord and a bent sapling as a spring mechanism. Based on a diagram I half remembered from a survival book I'd read in a dentist's waiting room 4 years ago. The snare didn't work the first night. I rebuilt it. The second night, nothing. I rebuilt it again, adjusting the trigger sensitivity, moving the anchor point, baiting the trail with salal berries. The third morning, I heard a sound from the ridge that was not clicking, and not wind, and not anything I'd heard in the watershed. A rhythmic, percussive thrashing. I knew what it was before I reached it. The doe had hit the snare, and the sapling had lifted, but not cleanly. Her rear leg was caught, and she was alive, panicking, slamming against the ground with enough force to shake the trees. I killed her with the bow saw. It was not fast. It was not clean. It was the worst thing I have ever done. And I include every decision made on September 14th in that calculus. Bo sat 10 yards back and watched without moving. When it was over and the thrashing stopped and the silence rushed back in, I knelt in the mud with blood up to my elbows, and I apologized to an animal that could no longer hear me. I don't know who I was apologizing to, her, myself. Whatever part of my identity had believed, until that moment, that I was a person who didn't do things like this. I butchered her badly. I'd never dressed an animal. I used the Leatherman in guesswork and lost probably 1/3 of the usable meat to incompetence. But what I salvaged, maybe 40 pounds of venison, I carried back to the station in 3 trips and spent the rest of the day cutting it into strips and hanging them over the smoke of my crude stove to dry. The smell was the problem. Smoke and blood and rendered fat, carried on the December air through a watershed that was otherwise scentless and still. If the crawdads and fish had kept my caloric profile low enough to be invisible, the deer announced my position to everything with a nose or a receptor within a mile. They came that night. Not 2 this time, 7. Moving up the fire road in a loose group, not together exactly, but pulled by the same signal, converging on the same source. I heard the cans first my perimeter alarm, clattering in sequence, east to west, like a wave. Then the clicking, layered now, overlapping, a chorus of that wet mechanical sound that populated my nightmares. Bo was at the door before I reached it. Hackles up, the deep growl running. But her tail was tucked, and I could see the whites of her eyes, and I understood. This was different. 2 she could face. 7 was math she could do, and the answer was no. I killed the stove fire. Darkness swallowed the station. I pressed my eye to the gap between the door and the frame, and watched them come up the slope in the moonlight. Gray shapes against gray trees, and the sound of them was everywhere. They reached the concrete pad. One of them put its hands on the door, not pushing, pressing, flat palms against the steel, like someone testing whether a surface was hot. The door flexed inward a 1/4 inch, and I felt the vibration in my spine. Bo was shaking. So was I. We stood in the dark on opposite sides of the door, me braced against it, her braced against me, and we breathed as quietly as we could, while the dead stood on our doorstep and smelled our dinner. They stayed for 2 hours. 2 hours of clicking and pressing and that rasping intake of air. 2 hours during which I did not move, did not shift my weight, did not allow my body to produce a single sound louder than my own controlled exhalation. Bo matched me. I don't know how. I don't know what communication passed between us in that darkness, chemical, postural, something deeper than either. But she regulated her breathing to mine. trembling silently against my leg. And neither of us made a sound. They left before dawn. I don't know why. The scent must have diffused, or a stronger signal called them elsewhere, or whatever drives them simply ran down like a clock. One by one, the clicking faded. The cans rattled in reverse sequence west to east, and the forest closed behind them. I opened the door at sunrise. The concrete pad was smeared with handprints. Dark, tacky, that wrong color. 7 sets, some of them overlapping, pressed on top of each other, as though they'd been reaching for the same spot. I smoked the rest of the venison fast, in daylight, and sealed it in Ziploc bags I'd found in my pack. Then I dismantled the smoke vent, plugged the wall hole, and resolved to eat cold food for as long as the meat lasted. From that night forward, we were invisible by choice. No fire after dark, no cooking smell, no sound. We became the absence of stimulus in a world that hunted by stimulus. And the discipline of that silence remade us into something that was not quite human and not quite animal, but something in between. Something that survived by refusing to be perceived. January, the worst month. Not because of cold, though the cold was brutal. Nights in the 20s, ice on the creek, mornings where I'd wake with frost on the inside of the door and Beau's breath visible in the dark. Not because of hunger, though the venison was rationed down to strips the width of my finger, 2 per day for me, 1 for Beau, supplemented by whatever the frozen creek would yield. Not because of the dead, though I saw them 3 more times that month from distance, always moving, always following the road or the ridgeline, pulled by currents I couldn't map. January was the worst month because of what it did to my mind. I stopped talking, not deliberately, not a decision. The words just stopped coming. I'd open my mouth to narrate my routine to Beau, the ongoing monologue that had been my lifeline. Since October, and nothing would form, the thoughts were there, but the bridge between thought and language had eroded, like a trail washed out by months of rain. And I'd stand there with my mouth open and my dog looking at me, and nothing would come out. At first I panicked. I forced myself to speak. Read aloud from the Forest Service manual. Recited half-remembered poems from high school. Counted. Named things. Tree, rock, water, dog, hand, sky. The words came out rough and strange, like a language I was relearning. And the sound of my own voice in the silence of the watershed was alien, wrong, an intrusion. Then I stopped fighting it. This is the part that frightens me to remember. Not because of the danger, but because of how easy it was. The silence wasn't painful. It was a relief. Language had been effort constant, grinding effort, and without it, the world simplified further. I woke, I pumped water, I checked traps, I foraged, I maintained the station, I watched the tree line, I slept. The actions didn't require words. They required attention. And attention without narration was cleaner, sharper, more efficient. I could hear things I'd been talking over. The specific pitch of wind through different tree species. The difference between rain on fir needles and rain on alder leaves. The sound Beau's nails made on frozen ground versus thawed ground. A vocabulary of sensation replaced the vocabulary of language, and it was, for a while, enough. Beau adapted too. Or maybe she'd been waiting for this. Without my voice filling the space between us, we developed something else. A communication built on posture and proximity and breath, and the small, precise movements of bodies that have learned each other completely. I knew by the set of her shoulders whether she was tracking a sound or a scent. She knew by the angle of my head whether I was alert or resting. We moved through the watershed like a single organism with 2 bodies, coordinated without signal, responsive without command. I was becoming something. Not a zombie, nothing so dramatic. I was becoming a creature that lived in its senses instead of its syntax. And the creature was competent and calm, and it did not suffer. And giving up suffering felt like giving up the last thing that made me a person. It was Bo who stopped it. Mid-January. Freezing rain. I was sitting on the cot in the dark station, not sleeping, not thinking in any way that would register as thought, just existing in the sound of ice on the roof. When Bo did something she'd never done. She put her front paws on the cot, pushed her face into mine, and barked one bark. Sharp, loud, enormous in the silence we'd built together. I flinched so hard I fell off the cot. She stood over me. Her tail was wagging. Not the slow, cautious wag of uncertainty, a full, sweeping, idiotic wag. The kind she used to do when I came home from work, and she'd been waiting behind the door. She barked again. Then she grabbed the sleeve of my wool layer in her teeth and pulled. I didn't understand. She pulled harder, dragged me toward the door. I stumbled after her, confused, alarmed, and she scratched at the door with both paws and barked a third time. And the barks were so loud in the silence of the watershed that I almost tackled her to make her stop. Didn't she know? Didn't she understand the rule? Silence, silence. We survive by silence. She looked at me, amber eyes, direct, unblinking. And I heard myself say, "What?" One word, hoarse and broken and ridiculous. But a word, a human word, chosen and spoken, pushed through the collapsed bridge of language by a dog who had decided, in her own alien intelligence, that I'd been quiet long enough. I sat on the floor and said it again. "What? What do you want? What is it?" Sentences, clumsy, halting, but sentences. Bo wagged her tail and licked my face, and I was crying again. The same messy, stupid crying from September. And I said her name, and then I said my name, and then I said every name I could remember: Margot, Peter, Dana, Caleb, Mom, Dad, and the names were bridges, and the bridges held, and I was, for another moment at least, a person. She had saved my life. Not from the dead. From the living silence that was eating me from the inside. February brought something worse than the dead. It brought the living. I saw the smoke on a Tuesday, thin white, rising from a point maybe 2 miles south, on the far side of the ridge that separated my watershed from the next drainage. Wood smoke, controlled. The kind that comes from a fire built inside a structure, not a wildfire or an accident. Someone was burning fuel on purpose, which meant someone was alive and close and not hiding. My first reaction was hunger. Not for food I was managing, barely, through a combination of winter foraging, ice fishing through a hole I'd chipped in the creek, no, and the last shreds of smoked venison. Hunger for people. The January silence had receded, but left a residue. A brittleness in my sense of self that I could feel when I tried to think in long sequences. I wanted to hear a voice that wasn't mine. I wanted to be witnessed. My second reaction was fear. Because every piece of evidence I'd gathered in 5 months said that people were the second most dangerous thing in this new world. And the most dangerous thing was your own need for them. I watched the smoke for 3 days. It appeared each morning, lasted until midday, then vanished. Consistent, disciplined, someone with a routine and the resources to maintain it. On the 4th day, I packed a day bag, left Bo's water bowl full, told her to stay. She understood stay, had always understood it, obeyed it absolutely, and hiked south along the ridgeline to look. The camp was in a small meadow at the bottom of the adjacent drainage. 3 structures, a wall tent, a lean-to woodshed, and what looked like a repurposed Forest Service equipment trailer with a stovepipe chimney. Organized, established. Not new, this had been here for weeks, maybe longer. I counted 4 people over 2 hours of observation from the ridge. 3 adults and 1 teenager, maybe 15 or 16. They moved with the unhurried economy of people who'd found their rhythm. One of the adults, a woman, tall, short hair, was splitting wood. Another was doing something at the creek that involved buckets. The teenager was sitting on the trailer steps reading a book. A book. Someone had carried a book into the apocalypse, and a kid was sitting on metal steps in February reading it. I went back to the station. I told Bo about them. She listened with her usual attention and offered no opinion. I thought about it for 2 more days. 2 days of watching the smoke rise and fall. 2 days of arguments with myself that felt increasingly theatrical. They could be dangerous. They could be armed. They could be the kind of people who take what you have, because the truth underneath the arguments was simpler and harder. I was afraid they wouldn't want me. That I'd walk down that ridge and offer myself to strangers, and they'd look at me gaunt, dirty, half-feral, talking to a dog, and turn me away. That the bus would happen again. That I'd be told there was no room. On the 6th day, Bo made the decision for me. I'd been hiking the ridge for my daily observation, a habit that had become its own kind of trap. Surveillance as substitute for action. And I'd brought Bo because she'd scratched at the door when I tried to leave her. She'd never done that before. She'd always accepted stay. But that morning, she refused, and I was too tired to argue. We reached the ridge. I settled into my watching position behind a downed fir. Bo sat beside me for approximately 30 seconds. Then she stood up and walked down the hill. Bo, stay, come, Bo. She didn't look back. She trotted down the slope with her tail up and her ears forward, moving with the easy confidence of a dog who has decided where she's going. And she walked straight into the meadow and up to the woman splitting wood and sat down at her feet. The woman dropped the axe. I watched from the ridge as Bo did what Bo had always done. Sat, waited, offered herself to be assessed. The woman crouched, extended her hand. Bo sniffed it and then leaned in, pressing her weight against the woman's legs. And the woman put both arms around my dog and held on. And from 200 yards away, I could see her shoulders shaking. The teenager came out of the trailer. Then the other 2 adults. They gathered around Bo like she was a fire, touching her, talking to her. And she absorbed their attention with the dignity of an ambassador arriving at a foreign court. I stood up on the ridge. The woman saw me. She straightened, one hand still on Bo's back. And we looked at each other across 200 yards of clear-cut slope. She raised her hand, not waving, beckoning. I walked down the hill. Her name was Andy Sung. She was 44, a former wildland firefighter who'd been on a prescribed burn crew in the Clackamas district when the world ended. The other adults were Thomas Reyes, a mill worker from Estacada, and his wife Lucinda, who'd been an elementary school teacher. The teenager was their nephew, Gabriel, who had been staying with them for the fall semester because his parents were going through a divorce in Salem. They'd been in the meadow since October. Andy had known about the trailer from her fire crew work and had led the Reyes family here when Estacada fell apart. They had what I didn't. Tools, real ones, an axe, a buck saw, trapping wire, a .22 rifle with 47 remaining rounds. They also had what I'd been afraid to want. Conversation, structure, the social architecture that keeps a human brain from collapsing into pure function. And they'd been watching my watershed too, Andy told me this while I sat at her fire drinking actual coffee. She'd found a stash in the Forest Service trailer, with Bo curled at my feet like she'd always lived here. "We saw your smoke in September," Andy said. "Just for a couple weeks, then it stopped. I assumed you'd moved on or died. I stopped making fires. Smart. After the deer?" I looked at her. "Sound carries in these drainages," she said. "I heard the snare, the thrashing." She paused. "And I heard them come that night. The clicking. You heard all of that and you didn't." "Didn't what? Walk 2 miles in the dark toward the sound of the dead? I've got 3 people depending on me, Owen." The way she said it wasn't cruel. It was the same arithmetic the sergeant had done at the bus. Resources, headcount, risk. I understood it. I was starting to think it was the only math that mattered anymore. "But you survived it," she said. 5 months solo, with a dog. That means you're either very lucky or very stubborn, and I can use both. The integration wasn't smooth. I want to be honest about that too, because the version where the lonely survivor finds a community and everything is warm and healed is a fantasy. And fantasies are a luxury I can't afford. I was strange. I knew I was strange. 5 months of solitude had rewired my responses in ways that surfaced without warning. I flinched when anyone moved behind me. I couldn't eat with people watching. I'd take my portion and carry it to the edge of the meadow and eat facing the tree line, guarding the food with my body, even though no one was going to take it. I couldn't sleep in the trailer with the others. The sounds of breathing that weren't Bo's jolted me awake hourly. And after 2 nights, I moved my bedding to the lean-to and slept there with Bo against my chest and the open sky above, and the sound of the forest in my ears. Because that was the only sound that meant safe. Gabriel was the one who bridged it. Not through effort, through indifference. He was 15, and everything bored him, including my strangeness. And he treated me with the casual disregard that teenagers reserve for adults who aren't yet worth categorizing. He'd sit near me while I checked traps and read his book Dune, dog-eared and water-stained, and occasionally read passages aloud without being asked. And the sound of someone else's voice delivering someone else's words was a medicine I didn't know I needed. "You talk to the dog like she's a person," he said one afternoon. "She is a person. She's a dog. She's the reason I'm alive." He considered this with the solemn gravity of a teenager encountering information that doesn't fit his framework. Then he went back to reading. "Tomas taught me to use the .22. Not for the dead the noise would bring more, but for hunting. Up on the high ridges where the sound would dissipate before it reached the valleys. Lucinda taught me to identify winter fungi I'd been walking past for months. Andy taught me fire discipline, water purification, and the organizational logic of a base camp that could sustain 5 people through a Cascade winter. I taught them Bo. Which sounds absurd, but it wasn't. I taught them how to read her stillness, her signals, the precise vocabulary of posture that constituted our early warning system. Within 2 weeks, Tomas was deferring to Bo on his perimeter checks, watching her body before he watched the trees. And the camp security doubled without a single additional resource. Bo accepted them. Not with the immediate, total lean she'd given Andy on the first day that I think was calculated. A move by a smarter-than-average dog who understood that charming the strongest person in a group was how you secured entry. With the others, she was slower, more measured. She let Gabriel scratch her ears after 3 days. She walked patrol with Thomas after a week. She slept in the trailer with Lucinda during the one night I went on an overnight scouting trip, and I came back to find them curled together on the cot, Lucinda's hand on Bo's belly, both asleep. I stood in the doorway and watched them and felt something I couldn't name. Not jealousy, not loss. Something more like vertigo, the realization that the bond I'd thought was singular, closed, a circuit between two beings, was actually open, expandable, capable of including others without diminishing. Bo had known this all along. She'd walked down the hill because she'd known. The question I couldn't answer, the one that kept me awake in the lean-to with the stars above and the cold pressing in, was whether she'd done it for herself or for me. March. The days were lengthening. The creek was thawing. Andy's camp had stabilized into something that felt, on good days, like the sketch of a life. Then Tomas found the radio. It was in the cab of an abandoned timber company truck 2 miles east, wedged under the seat alongside a thermos and a mud-stained copy of Field and Stream. A handheld CB, battery dead but the unit intact. Andy wired it to a car battery she'd been saving. And on March 9th, 5.5 months after the world ended, we heard another human voice that didn't belong to any of us. It was a loop, automated, flat, repeating every 4 minutes on Channel 9. FEMA recovery zone established. Willamette Valley corridor. Salem to Eugene. Military escort available from designated pickup points. Bring identification. Bring medications. No firearms permitted inside the zone. Livestock and domestic animals subject to quarantine and assessment. Repeat. FEMA recovery zone established. The word quarantine hit me like a physical blow. What does assessment mean? I asked. Nobody answered because nobody knew, and that was the problem. We listened to the loop for 3 days. It didn't change. It didn't elaborate. Subject to quarantine and assessment sat in my chest like a stone. And at night, I'd hold Bo and run the possibilities. Quarantine meant temporary separation. Maybe a health check, a pen somewhere with food and water, and someone who'd look at her and see a healthy dog and give her back. Or quarantine meant a cage she'd never come out of. Assessment meant evaluation, maybe. Or assessment meant a decision made by someone with a clipboard, the same arithmetic, the same math resources, head count, risk. We should go, Andy said. This is what we've been waiting for. We've been surviving. Surviving isn't living, Owen. We're 6 people and a dog in a drainage ditch. There are resources in that valley. Medical care, structure, a future. The broadcast says no firearms. We can cache the .22. It says animals are subject to assessment. She looked at me, then at Bo, then back at me. You can't stay here alone again. I wasn't alone. The silence after that was long and specific. Andy was measuring me the way she measured everything: firewood, water levels, ammunition, risk. I could see her calculating whether I was an asset making a tactical argument, or a man choosing a dog over civilization. The answer was both. It had always been both. I'm not asking you to leave her, she said carefully. I'm asking you to trust that the people running that zone aren't going to. You don't know what they're going to do. You're inferring from a recorded loop that doesn't explain anything. Tomas and Lucinda said nothing. Gabriel, reading in the corner, turned a page. Then come and see, Andy said. We scout the pickup point. We assess it ourselves. If it's wrong, we come back. We left the drainage on March 14th. All 6 of us, Andy, Tomas, Lucinda, Gabriel, me, and Bo. Andy had argued for a 2-person scout, and I'd refused to be separated from the group or from Bo. And since Bo was the reason for the reconnaissance, the argument collapsed into collective movement. The designated pickup point was a former lumber mill parking lot 15 miles west, on the edge of the Willamette Valley where the foothills flattened into farmland. It took us 2 days to cover the distance, moving through timber and along secondary roads, avoiding the main corridors where the dead still wandered in their slow, stimulus-driven orbits. Bo led. She'd taken point naturally, ranging 30 yards ahead, checking the air, checking the ground, reporting back with her body. Andy watched her work with open admiration. Tomas followed her signals without question. Even Gabriel, who maintained his principled indifference to everything, walked where Bo walked. The mill parking lot was occupied. 3 military trucks, a medical tent with a red cross, and a perimeter of concrete barriers staffed by National Guard soldiers who looked young and tired and alive. A line of maybe 20 civilians waited near the medical tent. Organized, calm, real. Andy went first. She walked out of the tree line with her hands visible, and a soldier met her halfway, and there was a conversation I couldn't hear. And then she waved us forward. The processing was efficient. Names, former addresses, medical screening, blood draw, temperature, pupil check. The soldier doing intake was a woman about my age with a clipboard and a manner that was brisk without being unkind. Any weapons? No, Andy said. We'd cached the .222 miles back. Any animals? 1 dog, I said. The soldier looked at Bo, then at me, then at her clipboard. Animals go to the quarantine pen for assessment. Veterinary check, behavioral screening, rabies titer, standard protocol. How long? 72 hours. And if she passes? She's returned to you inside the zone. And if she doesn't pass? The soldier's face didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted a flicker of recognition, the awareness that she was delivering information to someone who would not receive it casually. That's determined by the veterinary team. Determined how? Sir, I don't make that policy. The vet team evaluates health, temperament, and resource viability. Dogs that pass are reunited with their owners. That's the standard outcome. Standard outcome, not guaranteed outcome. The language was precise and the precision was deliberate, and I heard in it the echo of every institution that had ever managed risk by managing language. Bo sat beside me, leaning against my leg, watching the soldier with mild interest. She was calm. She was always calm around new people. That was who she was. A dog who'd been found in a house of neglect and had decided that every new person was a chance rather than a threat. She would walk into that quarantine pen without resistance. She would sit in a cage and wait for me, with the same absolute trust she'd shown every day for 3 years. And if someone on the other side of that cage decided she wasn't worth the food, she would never know I'd let it happen. Give me a minute, I said. I walked to the edge of the parking lot with Bo. Andy followed at a distance, close enough to be present, far enough to give space. The others waited by the trucks. I knelt down. Bo sat in front of me, our faces level. Amber eyes. That direct, unguarded gaze that had never asked me for anything except presence. I don't know what to do, I said. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against mine. She did this, sometimes had done it since I first brought her home from the rescue. This gesture that wasn't a lick or a nuzzle, but a press, a sustained contact, skull to skull, weight to weight. I'd never known another dog who did it. I didn't know what it meant in dog language. In ours, it meant, I'm here. You're here. This is where we are. I stayed like that for a long time. Then I stood up. I walked back to the soldier with the clipboard. Bo walked beside me, matching my pace. I'll go in with her, I said. Sir? The quarantine. I'll stay in the pen with her for the 72 hours. I'll go through whatever screening you want. But I'm not leaving her alone in a cage. The soldier looked at me, then at her clipboard, then over her shoulder at a man in civilian clothes, the vet, probably standing near the medical tent. Some kind of silent communication passed between them. That's not standard protocol. I understand. You'd be giving up your processing slot. The next convoy to the zone isn't for 5 days. You'd be sitting in a quarantine pen in a parking lot for 3 days minimum when you could be inside the zone tonight. I understand. Is the dog? She stopped, started again. Is there a medical reason? A service animal designation? No, she's just my dog. The soldier stared at me. I could see her doing the math, the same math everyone had been doing since September 14th. And I watched her arrive at a number that didn't fit on her clipboard and decide, in the space of a breath, to solve for a variable that wasn't in her training. Let me talk to the lieutenant. She walked away. I stood in the parking lot with Bo, and the sun was out for the first time in weeks, and the mountains behind us were white with late snow. And the valley ahead was green in the way that Western Oregon is always green. Thoughtlessly, extravagantly, as if the world couldn't help itself. Andy appeared beside me. You know this might not work. I know. You know you might end up back in those mountains. I've survived those mountains. Owen. She put her hand on my arm. I need you to understand something. What you did up there, the 6 months, the creek, the deer, the silence that was remarkable. But it was also destroying you. I watched you eat facing the tree line for 2 weeks. I heard you stop talking in your sleep. That station saved your body, and it was killing everything else. Bo stopped it. Bo stopped one piece of it. She interrupted the worst of it. But she can't give you what people give you. And you can't give her what she needs by hiding in a drainage forever. I'm not hiding. I'm negotiating. She almost smiled. You're negotiating with the United States military to let you sit in a dog pen. Yes. And you'll go into the zone? If they clear her? If they clear her, we go in together. And if they don't? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She knew. Andy always knew it was what made her a leader, and also what made her exhausting. She saw the full shape of every decision, including the ones you hadn't admitted to yourself. The soldier came back. The lieutenant says it's irregular, but not prohibited. You can stay in the quarantine area during the assessment period. You'll be screened separately. The vet will conduct the animal evaluation on standard timeline. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The pen is a chain-link enclosure with a tarp roof. It's not comfortable. I've slept on a concrete floor for 6 months. I'll manage. She almost smiled too. 2 almost smiles in 1 minute. That was more warmth than I'd earned in half a year. The quarantine pen was exactly what she'd described. Chain link, 10 by 10, a tarp overhead, a water bucket, a folding cot. Bo and I walked in together, and the gate closed behind us, and it was, I realized, the smallest space we'd shared since the station. Bo circled twice, lay down on the cot, and closed her eyes. I sat on the concrete beside her, and I put my hand on her ribs, visible still. But less than January, patting slowly over the bones, and I counted her breaths the way I'd counted them every night for 6 months. And the counting was a prayer to nothing, a liturgy of presence. And she breathed in and breathed out, and I breathed with her. And the sun moved over the tarp, and the soldiers' voices murmured beyond the chain link. And somewhere in the valley, a future existed that might include both of us, and might not. And I sat with the uncertainty that the way she'd taught me to sit with everything, still, attentive, without forcing the next moment to arrive. The vet came the next morning. A quiet man named Pradeep, who smelled like antiseptic and moved with the unhurried precision of someone accustomed to patients who couldn't speak. He examined Bo thoroughly. Teeth, joints, coat, eyes, reflexes, temperament. She submitted to all of it with the patience of a dog who has been handled by rescue workers and shelter staff, and one man who held her every night for 6 months. Pradeep tested her reactions to sudden sound, to other dogs barking in adjacent pens, to a stranger's approach. She passed everything. Of course she passed everything. She was Bo. On the morning of the 3rd day, Pradeep opened the gate. She's clear, healthy, well socialized, no signs of aggression or communicable disease. Underweight but recovering. He paused. She's a good dog. I know. She's also, he glanced at his notes, remarkably calm for an animal that's been through what you described. Most dogs in prolonged survival situations develop significant behavioral issues. Anxiety, resource guarding, fear aggression. She has none of that. She had me. He looked at me over his clipboard. I think, he said carefully, it may have been the other way around. I didn't argue. We went into the valley. All of us, Andy, Thomas, Lucinda, Gabriel, me, and Bo. The zone was real. Fenced, patrolled, organized into blocks of reclaimed farmland and repurposed structures. It wasn't paradise. It was crowded and rationed and governed by the same imperfect arithmetic that had put a sergeant with a clipboard at a bus stop in Portland 6 months ago. But it was human. And humans were what I'd almost stopped being. And the distance between those two things, person and creature, syntax and sensation, was a distance I'd measure for the rest of my life. Bo sleeps on the bed now. A real bed, in a real room, in a converted farmhouse, on the eastern edge of the zone. She has a bowl that's full every morning, and a yard where she circles in her expanding spiral, and a boy named Gabriel who reads to her in the afternoons. And she tolerates all of it, with the gracious calm of someone who always knew this was where we were going. I still wake at dawn. I still check the perimeter. I still eat facing the tree line sometimes, when the old wiring fires and the creature I became rises briefly to the surface before sinking back. But I talk. Every day I talk. To Andy about logistics, to Thomas about the weather, to Lucinda about seeds, to Gabriel about Dune, to strangers about nothing, to Bo about everything. She watches me with those amber eyes, and I understand now what she was doing in January when she barked me back from the silence. She wasn't saving me from the wilderness. She was refusing to let me disappear. She had chosen me 3 years ago in a house full of abandoned dogs. And she had chosen me again on the ridge when she walked down the hill. And she would keep choosing me over and over in the simple language of leaning in, pressing close, staying the only promise either of us ever needed to keep. They wouldn't let my dog on the evacuation bus, so we survived, together, the way we were always going to.